Marxism is believed to be an extension of Hegelian dialectic. Hegelian dialectic contains within itself two important concepts which are used by Marxists to forward their theory. The first concept, which is widely known, is the duality between the master and the slave, which is converted under Marxism into the dichotomy between the oppressor and the oppressed. However, this is not the most pertinent concept of Hegel that Marxists borrow. The second concept of Hegel, which is the basis of Marxism, is the duality between universality and individuality. In this video, the Hegelian Marxist Slavoj Zizek is talking about this concept of universality as it relates to white liberalism. Slavoj will try to present Marxism as a better alternative than white liberalism in achieving this concept of universality. And here we would see that Slavoj does not have a good understanding of Hegel's concepts. It is not surprising because Hegel's work is extremely difficult to understand, and it would be very surprising that Marxists would be able to understand Hegel's work when not many do. But Marxists are not interested in understanding what Hegel wrote, but they are instead interested in using what Hegel wrote in order to achieve their objective, because Hegel's work contains within itself truth about two things. The first of them is reality, and the second is dialectic, and both are important in achieving political victory. So let's start this video and hear what Slavoj has to say.
It's a well-known, I'm sorry if you know it, I used it 2-3 times in my books. It was also used already by many philosophers, even Derrida. I know Derrida used it. A joke about Jews gathered in a synagogue on Shabbat to publicly declare their failures or whatever, and first a mighty rabbi says, "Forgive me, O God, I am nothing, not worthy of your attention." After him, a rich Jewish merchant says, "Forgive me, O God, I am a worthless nothing." Then a poor ordinary Jew steps forward and says, "Forgive me, God, I am also nothing." At that point, it doesn't matter who, the rich merchant steps, a rich rabbi, and says, "But who this guy think that he is? He think how dares he also to claim that he is a nothing? We are the nothing." That's the white liberal lie today. I literally experienced the same situation already 25 years ago at a very politically correct conference where white liberals were excelling each other into who will humiliate himself more. We are to blame everything. Oh, Eurocentrism, we brought slavery, it's nightmare, we are guilty of everything. Christianity, the worst one, it was invented to screw other races and so on and so on. And then a black friend of mine, not to embarrass him, I will not mention his name, said, "Well, wait a minute, guys, we are not so innocent. We also had our own Louis Farrakhan, black racism and so on." And I noticed that the mighty white liberal professors exchanged these embarrassed gazes, which meant precisely, "No, sorry guy, we are to blame, we are nothing. Who are you to say that you are also nothing?" The message was clear. Precisely when white liberals humiliate themselves, and I noticed this again and again, like, we are worthless, we don't have the right, that's subtle racism expressed in this forum.
All of this till here tells an interesting point about Marxism. So Marxism starts from this basic idea that there is an oppressed person who wants to be freed. Self-deprecating language basically is something that is hinting towards some type of oppression which is committed in some way, because that is the only reason why self deprecating humor arises or self deprecating language arises. For example, imagine a comedian making jokes about himself. If he is making jokes about his physical state, the reason why people find it humorous is because they have negative views about that physical trait. No one ever makes self deprecating jokes about those traits which are considered by the people to be of great value. There is something that is going on here. If someone is making jokes about him being obese, the reason why people laugh is because people share within themselves a certain idea that the comedian also wants to share, that being obese is bad. Thus, being obese would also carry few negative consequences in the society, apart from the physical consequences that biology dictates. This negative attitude towards being obese would result in a lot of lost opportunities and would also result in obese people being treated in some way as less than non obese people. This is a certain kind of oppression, or it could be framed as an oppression under Marxist dialectic. Any language that uses self deprecation is pointing to a thing that is not considered equal to the others. This is where Marxism comes into play. The oppressed, to be freed from the oppressor, need the oppressors to be gone completely. Because as long as the oppressor stays, as long as there is some difference that persists, that is relevant to Marxism, there would be an oppression. But if people are not different from each other, then there would be no one who could claim to have superiority over any other person, because there would be no trait based on which that superiority could be claimed. This is a very interesting phenomenon, and this relates to the concept of universality, which Zizek would explain shortly further.
If you are an exotic nation, like if Native Americans dance their tribal dances and so on, that's perfect. They are asserting their particular identity. If I say, let's assert German identity, oh, you are a Nazi, you are a fascist. Okay, I know in what sense this is true. But nonetheless,
And this is here we see that Zizek understands that the monster that he is creating is stronger than himself. He is attacking the concept of individuality, or rather, what could be considered a midway stage between individuality and universality, that is, the tribal mentality. And he is saying that for some reason we consider identities like Native American identity to be something which is good, which is something to be preserved, but an identity like that of a German is something that needs to be abandoned. He's critiquing that concept because, according to Zizek's view, no tribal identity should have place in the society, except, of course, the tribal identity of the working class or the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. In this way, Zizek is using Marxism to its rightful extent. However, he is afraid, and thus he adds that he understands how those two claims are different, how there is a reason to be proud of Native American identity, but there is no reason to be proud of German identity. And that obviously is the historical difference between the two. In order to appeal to the groups that are marginalized, or that have been historically perceived to be marginalized. Zizek has to develop a form of tribal identities and has to preserve those tribal identities so he can use those marginalized groups as soldiers in his war against the capitalist elites. And for this, he knows that he cannot anger the people who would want to retain their Native American identity and to appease them and to convince them that that identity would not be immediately attacked. He has to appeal to history. This is also the reason why you see feminists regularly appealing to history in order to justify privileges awarded to women, because the whole identity, tribal identity, that feminism is trying to maintain can only be justified under Marxism based on some historical observation or historical analysis, which one of which Marx himself did in order to justify the workings of proletariat. This is a very important thing because it shows how Zizek is not completely honest. And the reason why he's not completely honest is because perhaps he's afraid of losing the support that he would have if he does not try to take away all the identities of the groups he supports at once. Let's move on further and see what he has to say.
There is something false in it. Why? Because denying you the right to your particular identity, in this false sense, humiliating yourself, means that in a much more subtle way, you reserve for yourself the universal position. I notice again and again how.
And this is where Hegel's concept of universality comes into all of this discussion. When any person is trying to show himself as guilty of something or self deprecates himself, he is actually trying to boost his own ego with respect to others. If a comedian, for example, makes a joke about himself based on his obesity, in one sense, one could say that he is trying to attack himself, attack his own physical trait, which would be very surprising. Why would a person do that? Some would argue that he does that for money. But there is another reason. Some people are able to do that without effort. Some people are able to humiliate themselves without effort because they believe in trying to reserve that universality for themselves. What they are essentially saying is that by attacking themselves, they are becoming greater than others because by pointing towards their flaws, what they are trying to achieve is that their flaws are distinct from themselves and as such could be pointed out, and hence they are great because such flaws can be corrected, and ultimately they are reflecting within themselves a universal state, and that state is the height of Hegel's thesis as believed by Marxists. That is the point from where the oppressed never falls down. For this reason, special emphasis is placed in developing the victimhood culture, and that is the reason why such mentality is generated among the people in order for them to gain superiority over others by showing that their flaws are distinct from themselves because they are able to admit those flaws and they are able to point those flaws.
These same white liberals who are ready again and again to humiliate themselves, we are the worst, we are guilty of everything, and they like to play this game. Like whenever that something horrible goes on in third world countries, it must be a consequence of colonialism, you know. which, as a black friend that I have from Nigeria, once he exploded and said that this is the worst racism he can imagine. They treat us, he told me, like children. We are not even allowed to be evil on our own. If we are evil, it must be effect of colonialism and so on and so on.
This is where we understand the difference between liberalism and leftism. The liberals don't allow other uh, other identity groups to be evil because they want to be the only ones that could point out their own evil nature, and thus are able to argue that their evil nature is distinct from themselves. And we see that often, where white liberals would talk about overcoming their bad nature, and then that is something that they achieve by humiliating themselves. This is something that leftists do not like. And the reason why leftists do not like that, while agreeing with it in a very basic form, is because they want all groups, identity groups, to feel ashamed, because that is how leftism gains power. Leftism is ultimately universal. Leftists want their complete authority over the whole world. So if a liberal defends a tradition which leftists are against by arguing that the tradition is justified in sense of the evilness of liberalism or evilness of liberals, leftists lose power because no longer the group that holds on to those traditions believes that it is necessary to abandon those traditions. And leftists want these groups to abandon their traditions, so those traditions could be replaced by the traditions that are designed by the leftists in order to further their own cause. Unless and until every man on earth feels ashamed of not being the best, they would not submit to the leftists' ideology and leftists' values, and thus he has to make them feel ashamed. If there is some group who believes that it is not evil, then leftists cannot convince that group to be subservient of themselves, because why would they? They would not be ashamed of themselves and they would be proud of themselves. And if they are proud of themselves, why would they give up on their autonomy? In order to make people give up on their autonomy, it is just necessary that leftists do not allow liberals to protect any other group.
And that's why I claim white liberals love identity politics. It means minorities can have their particular identities, but we renounce our identity, but we keep this role of guardians of universality, which is why I wonder if this is also your experience. It's my regular experience that this same self-humiliating white liberals have no problem of correcting minorities if they perceive their position as wrong. Like, sorry guys, you fell into colonialist trap here, this is not the right way to talk about it, and so on and so on. So,
See, this is where he is confirming what I just said. He wants to make even the other identity groups feel ashamed. But because of white liberalism, he's not able to do so. Because white liberals would often defend these groups and prevent them from rising to a state which Zizek believes to be necessary to push leftism in these societies. And thus, all the people need to accept responsibility for their own evil, the left believes. Because unless they do that, leftism would not thrive in these societies.
that's why my advice is the one already elaborated. I've written about this a lot. I will not repeat myself. It's the one of Malcolm X. He was a true universalist. I'm sorry if I repeat myself here. Malcolm X. It was a Hegelian stroke of a genius. He emphasized it. X doesn't mean, oh, white people stole from us our roots. Yes, but his point is not, so let's regain our roots and look for some original tribal identity in Africa. No, he saw this being deprived of roots, X, like we don't have our particular identity, as a unique chance for the black people to propose a new universality which will be much more authentic and radical than white people's.
And this is uh, the most important point of this whole video. The point Slavoj Zizek is making here is that by losing their individuality, the marginalized groups are able to achieve a higher state of universality, or at least a potential chance to do that. But liberals do not want that, and this is the reason why they keep them in these strange chains where the marginalized groups are coddled and believed and made to believe that they cannot do anything wrong. This all explains the leftist trap. When the tribal identity of a group is destroyed, this is something that is not what makes leftists sad, but it is something of a joy for the leftists because that is something that they ultimately want. This is the reason why globalization is very similar to colonialism. Leftists want the other traditions, other cultures, other ways of life to be destroyed so that those values could be replaced by the values of the left. In such a way, this is the reason why leftists promote intersectionalism, because when intersectionalism is promoted, no group is able to retain its own identity, and its own identity is lost among other groups. A very good example is the losing identity of feminism by its merger with other groups like LGBT or Islam. For certain people, that would be puzzling, but it makes sense if one tries to understand what the leftists are ultimately talking about. Leftists do not want any of these groups to have their separate identity, but they cannot also remove those identities all at once, as talked earlier. So they try to dilute those identities by making all the marginalized groups come together. And when these perceived marginalized groups come together, they lose their identities by interacting with each other. This is the reason why so many women, for example, who are under the spell of feminism, now support transgender rights, which is, according to some, causing them to lose their own identity. This is what the leftists want ultimately, and this is something that is according to their plan. This type of intersectionalism gradually takes away the identity of all the people who are involved in this hegemony, resulting in leftist victory. Thus, when any group is being destroyed of its own identity, leftists pretend that they are offended, but they are not actually. And this is the reason why they cause those things to happen.
Universality, which is still a false universality. Always remember this. The true struggle is the struggle for universality. And liberals like to transform, mystify this struggle into the struggle of particular identities, where then they can play their game, of your particular identity, my particular identity, let them coexist, and so on and so on.
This is a very important Hegelian concept. When anyone tries to achieve individuality, he will invariably achieve universality. This is true of, for example, libertarians. However, if someone is trying to achieve universality, he will achieve individuality. And this is true of liberals. Liberals are trying to achieve universality. Zizek would talk about that. But because they have to develop this universality, they also have to recognize the individuality. And thus, by recognition of that individuality, they actually become the worshippers, the protectors, and the guardians of particular identities. That is, the individuality of the certain tribal identities. This is how liberals lose, and this is the reason why the liberal principles, which are supposed to be universal, become so disoriented and so pleading to certain special interest groups. This is, however, not true of libertarians. Libertarians, in trying to achieve individuality, actually achieve universality, at least in theory, because by looking and trying to maintain their own individuality, they are able to contrast that individuality in relation to universality. If every man is responsible for himself, a universal principle develops on its own. This universal principle applies to all men and affords them responsibility and the fruit of their responsibility. Liberals do not want that, and this is the reason why liberals fall prey to leftism.
No, the again, the problem today is the struggle of universalities. We have traditional liberal universality, which is the universality of particular modes of and then, but the problem is how do you define the universal dimension? The problem with particular identity politics is that it never can be all of your position. Every particular identity politics implies a universal dimension of how you construct the space in which particular identities coexist. Traditional version is the one of legal illusion. This was, otherwise I respected him, Richard Rorty's position, that people should be allowed their particular identities and the only universal frame is liberal law which organizes society in such a way that we all tolerate each other and so on and so on. I find this vision of particular identities and universality catastrophic.
And this is where we reach the universality that liberals seek, the universality of developing a legal system which does not look at the identities of particular groups, but instead tries to accommodate them to a similar standard. This liberal law is a universal point where all these identities must coincide, and those identities must follow this liberal law and remain under this liberal law. This liberal law, however, is not in reality in a way in which it is in this hypothetical scenario. The interaction between different identities often produced certain complexities which are then treated as exception under this liberal law. And even when they are not treated as exceptions, what generally happens is that because different identity groups maintain their individual identities within the framework of this liberal law, they are treated differently from each other by the liberal law because the standard is the same. For example, imagine that if there are different people or different identity groups which have a very different consumption and utility pattern, and the liberal law determines that for social welfare it would offer all of the people or all the identity groups the same thing in order so that they meet their food expenses. A particular food item would be provided, and that food item would be provided to all the identity groups, irrespective of the distinction between them. Not all identity groups would have a similar consumption and utility pattern. Some might, because of their habits, not like that food item, and some might very much like that food item. The liberal thus is unable to afford equal utility to all of these groups. So while equality is maintained in some hypothetical sense, this is not what equality is sought by the people. People do not people do not care about the hypothetical sense of equality, but they care about the consequences of being unequal. And so the group which is not getting the food it wants would be upset and would try its best in order to include in that welfare policy the food that it itself likes, which would again impede the utility of the group which does not like the new product or the new food item which is being proposed. And this would result in a clash of identities, ultimately, which would be indeed catastrophic.
I think that precisely here I remain a Marxist. What interests me is not my particular identity against your particular identity. It's the antagonism of my particular identity, the antagonism of your particular identity, and can we link our struggle against our own oppression, domination with yours?
And this is the place where we realize that Slavoj Zizek does not understand Hegel, but is just using Hegel to achieve his own objectives. Hegel was not talking about all of this. When different groups come together in form of intersectional politics, they in some sense do not try to present their identity as contrasting of another identity because they know that they need to work together in order to achieve victory. All of these groups are defined by their opponents, and thus they achieve a sort of unification, a universality. That universality is fake and would be present only as long as the oppressor or the antagonist lives. Once the antagonist or the oppressor is killed or is defeated, then these groups would begin fighting with each other in order to assert their dominance over the other, in order to control the maximal amount of resources. This is something that is easily known by observing the history. Slavoj Zizek seems to also know this. It is very unlikely that he does not understand this concept. However, he does not want this concept to come out to the public because that would mean that he would not be able to forward his theory of Marxism by creating this unified political class. And to create that unified political class, he needs to antagonize this class against some other group, which would of course be the bourgeoisie. Once the group is antagonized against that group, once all of these groups are antagonized against that group, there would be a sort of pseudo unity among all of these groups. So they do not lose their particular identities, but their particular identities are transformed into an identity or unified identity against the particular person with whom they are competing. This is very easily visible in things like sports, where players coming from different backgrounds in a team and with different dispositions and different mentalities work together in order to defeat their common foe. And the reason why they achieve this unification is because they have similar goal. Their identity is defined by the presence of their opponents. However, the whole issue with this is that once the opponents are defeated, then how the players would be able to maintain their identity? And the answer to this is that the opponents are never defeated. There would always be a group that is trying to assert its dominance over other groups, and thus there would always be power struggle, and thus there would always be the leftist ideology. And this is how the leftist ideology would keep itself alive, by creating and finding new problems and then presenting itself as the solver of those problems. This is how the leftists achieve victory. But to do that, they would ultimately have to switch their positions from one to another in order to align it against the dominant group. For example, a dominant group in a white Western country would be guilty of different problems than a group of blacks in Africa. And the leftists have to be against both, even if those actions contradict each other.
Can we link my antagonism with your antagonism? That's why, to conclude, in spite of all his failures and so on, I see something nonetheless unique. I don't have any great hopes of it. Probably it will alter and wrong, but I like this idea of Bernie Sanders plus the squad. Because we get what? We get young, non-white women, relatively radical politics, and then we get Bernie Sanders, an old white man. It's a winning coalition, okay. What Bernie Sanders got, I know, I was not in contact with him, but in Burlington I often go there with his people, and they said his obsession was for long years. For us, we should precisely also aim to get the votes of those disappointed, poorer white people who would have otherwise voted for Trump or whoever there. That's the winning coalition today. Don't sacrifice any of the two sides. If you do sacrifice old white men, not in the racist way, but in the sense of all those who feel betrayed and so on, then you will get, with all your political correctness and so on, you will get Trump re-elected.
And this is also very interesting. The reason why the old white men need to be supported under this leftist system would be just to get their votes. There would also be part of the intersectional fight, and of course this fight would be fought against the bourgeoisie. The old white men are only needed because Slavoj Zizek wants to win. He does not care about old white men. In fact, he does not care about the identities of any of these groups, unless of course he is biased to some identities over the others. What he cares about ultimately is Marxism, and how he is trying to appease the different groups in order to achieve their votes. He would be trying to appease the old white men in order to achieve their votes. But after these votes are polled, Zizek would not care. He would utterly destroy each of these identities by pitting them against each other, because he does not want any of them to survive. Zizek believes that he would ultimately achieve victory, but this is where he misunderstands Hegel. There is a difference between dichotomy and duality. Duality is about another thing existing as long as the first thing exists. Thus, as long as the slaves exist, the master would exist. As long as the oppressed exist, the oppressor would exist. And this duality is inherent in the world. And thus the oppressor and the oppressed would always exist. Zizek would never be able to win. Even if it destroys each of these identities, new identities would come through. And Zizek would also have to fight it. And Zizek would have to fight it all again. But he does not care, because it means that his political ideology would be useful till eternity. And this is the point. He does not want his ideology to go away. And this is his winning formula. As long as new problems are created, he would be able to solve them, and thus would always be able to keep his ideology in power. The issue may be different than the issues for which leftists are fighting today, but there would be few issues nonetheless, and that is how the leftist politics is framed. It never wants to win, because if it wins, its use would end, and the leftists would no longer enjoy power. It is like the case with many NGOs. They do not want to achieve victory because then the donations would stop and there would be no economic incentive for people in the NGO to agree to that finality.
Again and again. Again, I want to get not just rid of Trump. My message, and this is what caused so many misunderstandings, is that don't just fight Trump. Ask the crucial question. We lived till 10 years ago, maybe even less, in something like liberal hegemony. We had right-wing version, left-wing version, Republicans, Democrats, but basically it was a very homogeneous space. Then Trump happened. How could this have happened? What was wrong with the white liberal hegemony? The only way to really defeat Trump is to ask this self-critical question. If you just focus on Trump, you get caught into liberal nostalgia for the good old Princip times and so on and so on. Just to conclude with my usual story, that's why I don't agree. I find it deeply problematic, Handmaid's Tale, the novel. It's, I think, what, of course, I am also horrified by this convincing depiction of male fundamentalist terror and so on and so on. But what bothers me is this one, is this thing. I think that Handmaid's Tale is basically a work of what Frederick Jameson called nostalgia for the present. It paints a near future of fundamentalist rule, and it makes us feel well. And you see, haha, we are not yet there, we are still in a liberal society. No, the true question is, and it's never addressed in the novel, but how comes that out of this liberal paradise, Republic of Gilead exploded? Or for us, how comes that Trump exploded? We should be critical towards ourselves. Otherwise, Trump, if there will not be some catastrophe, which would be a nightmarish new world war or whatever, Trump will get re-elected. So my paradox is that it's not what democratic establishment is telling us. The only way to win Trump is to be more moderate, to get centrist votes. No, this was what Hillary tried, Clinton, and she lost. The paradox is that the only way to really win over Trump is to get the votes of all those, metaphorically called, old white men, poor guys who feel dispossessed and so on, and we only can get their voices by moving more to the left.
Slavoj Zizek is horrified by the works like Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's Tale is a liberal conception in which it tries to celebrate its own created world and the joys of that world against the solid, dull, gloomy, puritanical feature, a puritanical right-wing conception. This is how Liberals stroke their backs and feel good about the world that they have created. And obviously, this nice, wonderful atmosphere that is present is only illusory. This world is created from the sufferings of many. But Slavoj's point is not that. Slavoj is not horrified by the handmaiden's tale because of these reasons. He is horrified of the handmaiden's tale because it makes liberals feel good and prevents them from turning into stronger leftists than they currently are. For Slavoj, he wants to present the conditions as grim as possible, such that going further and further to the left seems always more appealing, and thus anything that is gained now is not enough. It is a slippery slope to the finality of Marxism. And this is not a fallacy in any sense, because this is what ultimately Slavoj wants to achieve. This is the reason why the bounds of this liberal hegemony are shifted ever increasingly towards the left.